I thought it was a good document. It was some 7,000 pages originally and then boosted to some 10,000 pages with the supplementary information. And whilst I can't claim to have read the lot, I've certainly read most of it. And I thought it really represented the intensive and world-class scientific effort that's gone into this project over the last 2 years.
At a formal hearing 3 months later, the RPDC's Julian Green gave the bad news to Gunns. There were fundamental omissions and errors in the IIS, and a considerable amount of work needs to be done to address deficiencies and obvious corrections. John Gay seemed unperturbed.
The IIS has been done by professional people, by scientists, and they have really done a lot of work and spent a lot of money getting this right. I think that there's a few small areas in the IIS that needs some more clarification, and I'm sure that we can give that and satisfy the RPDC.
But there was bad news at the hearing for the RPDC's expert panel as well, especially for Dr. Rafferty. It came from the barrister for the Greens.
He wanted to formally submit that I should disqualify myself from the panel on the grounds of apprehended bias. And of course I was absolutely gobsmacked.
Did you really believe he was biased?
We didn't know whether he was biased or not, but what we did know was that the Pulp Mill Task Force had material on their website originating from the company that he worked from that was very strongly supportive of the pulp mill.
The material placed on the Task Force website was enough to force Dr. Rafferty's resignation and to compromise the head of the RPDC, Julian Green, as well. Julian Green was cross. He had warned the Premier 2 years before about the government's pulp mill task force, and now there was more. Julian Green resigned.
He found out that the pulp mill task force had been dropping pamphlets into the letterboxes of residents living around the mill, assuring them that they would have or experience no adverse benefit from the mill. And he was absolutely furious because he said that's sub judice. It's for the RPDCs to decide whether there's any adverse effect.
The former Supreme Court judge, Christopher Wright, agreed to take over as head of the RPDC's expert panel. But before he agreed, he phoned Julian Green. The conversation made him wary about the government's role.
But on the other hand, I thought, well, with 2 resignations, they're not going to want a third, and I imagine they'll take some lesson from what's happened and remain aloof from the proceedings.
Were you given any assurances to that effect, or did you seek any?
No, I didn't.
Do you wish you had?
Well, I don't know if it would have done any good had I sought them or not, but in retrospect, I suppose it's easy to say one should have done that.
But it was, in fact, an approach from Gunns that raised the first concern.
I got a letter from Mr. Gay, writing on behalf of Gunns, in which he requested a private meeting with me to discuss aspects of the assessment process before I'd even really started the job. Now, obviously, it occurred to me that that was quite inappropriate, and I declined to have that meeting with him. Newspaper reports and correspondence from the proponent addressed to the panel have suggested that the proponent has been reluctant to provide the relevant material.
At the next formal hearing in February this year, Christopher Wright was blunt. The RPDC no longer expected to complete its task by May this year. It would run till November, maybe even longer. The timeline included public hearings on Gunns' impact statement, once it complied with the RPDC's guidelines, and it was already late. Wright blamed Gunns for the delays.
All or most of which appear to have resulted from Gunns' failure or inability to comply with their own prognostications.
The company had their lawyers present. They made no comment.
The following day, Gunns came out and gave a media release saying, we're going to work within the RPDC process, and I thought then, well, we're up and running.
But the timber communities knew that Gunns was unhappy. They were too. They wanted an end date and they wanted it soon.
There was no clear identification by the RPDC at the second directions hearing that on X date we will complete our work and we will provide our advice to government. Timber Communities Australia was looking for that. We know the developer was looking for that. And I say that anyone involved in the process wanted to know when the end game would be.
Gunns was fully informed of what was required well before work started. Their assessment work was started. It was all laid down in considerable detail. And Gunns accepted that, or said they accepted that process and would follow it, and said continually in meetings that I've been involved in, we will provide these data by such and such a deadline. And in most cases, just didn't.
3 days after the directions hearing, there was a crisis meeting held in the Premier's executive suite. Paul Lennon and John Gay were there. Gunns had written to the Premier saying the RPDC's expanded timeline was untenable and unacceptable. Every month of waiting for approval was said to be costing the company $10 million. Paul Lennon denies he gave John Gay any commitment, other than saying he'd meet with Christopher Wright. The account of that meeting is fiercely contested.
I was told that the Premier had decided that to speed the matter onward to the timetable that was suitable to Gunns, that is, finality by the 31st of July, it was proposed that a new ministerial direction would be given to water down, in effect, the steps and processes that the RPDC would need to follow to make its report. And in particular, I was told that public hearings would not be held.
I didn't say that. I did no such thing.
You didn't say you'd get rid of public hearings?
I did no such thing. And I asked him to give consideration to a shorter timeline.
Did you ask him to abandon public hearings?
I asked him to give consideration to a shorter timeline. Of course, that was the purpose of the meeting.
The panel members agreed with me, A, that it was impossible to complete our work by the 31st of July, and that, secondly, it was completely inappropriate and unacceptable to be forbidden to hold public hearings.
And that was unanimous?
Yes.
How do you explain the difference in the versions of events between you and a former Supreme Court judge?
Well, look, there were other people at the meeting.
What motivation then would he have to say these sorts of things today?
Well, you need to ask him.
Obviously, the status of the RPDC would have suffered immeasurably, I think, if we'd come along at a later date and said, oh, sorry, we've decided we're not going to hold public hearings and we're going to speed things up just so we can meet Gunns' deadline.
Is that what you thought effectively the Premier was doing?
Well, I don't know if he was doing it off his own bat or acting as a messenger boy for Gunns. But there was never any doubt in my mind that he was a very enthusiastic supporter of the whole process and that he was anxious throughout that a process that was acceptable to Gunns should be followed.
And you felt strongly enough about this to offer your resignation?
Well, I did, yes.
But he didn't threaten to resign to me. At no stage did he may well have said something to...
You got a call in New Zealand from Lindsay Horn telling you that he threatened to resign.
He may well have said something to Linda Hornsey. He did not threaten to resign to me. At no stage did I want to put Christopher Wright in a position where he felt his position was untenable.
Christopher Wright drafted his resignation letter, but the Secretary of the Premier's office, Linda Hornsey, checked with Paul Lennon and he was asked to stay on. Wright says he was told the ultimatum was off. So the RPDC moved on with assessing the latest supplementary material produced by Gunns.